Plato's divided line, is making that hard distinction between the two. You see, nowadays we think of knowledge as just a subset of beliefs, beliefs that meet certain conditions. But from Plato on through Kant, no, these are two very separate things. Knowledge involves either direct awareness of some sort as a result of dialectic or intuition of what is axiomatic, self-evident, or else demonstrative knowledge from such first principles. You see, that's the notion of knowledge. Belief lacks that.
Would you say that this clear distinction is something that up to Kant everyone sort of disinherits and then after Kant?
No, it's not as if history said, thus endeth the Platonic division between knowledge and belief, and we'll never look at it again. No. I wish it were that easy. Let's say that from Hume onwards, there is a weakening of the line between the two, so that you can't assume that people are using the terms in the completely separate sense that you get in the Platonic tradition. No. There was a development in epistemology in the, I guess, the 1960s, where we were defining knowledge as justified true belief. So knowledge is a subset of belief. And since the 60s, through the 70s and the 80s, people have been working on what are justification conditions. Under what conditions can you say you are justified in believing something's true? You see? But this is because of the weakening of the sense of knowledge. Okay, let's see. What's the next one? A priori and a posteriori. Yeah, and there you can pick it up in your reading around 369 to 373 in that general region. We're familiar already with the terms a priori and a posteriori simply because they have been so widely used, not so much by Kant's predecessors as by people talking about them. In Hume, the distinction was between relations of ideas and matters of fact. And in the subsequent empiricist tradition, Hume's distinction remains pretty firm. That relations of ideas are simply analytic. They have the form simply of logical truths, such as A equals A is not non-A. A bachelor is an unmarried male. A cat is a cat is a cat. Wherever you've got logical identity, okay, logical truths. Relations of ideas. If you know the ideas, you can work out such relationships. So he thought of mathematics as belonging in relations of ideas. Because granted the axioms, you work out relationships between axioms, the corollaries, in proving theorems. And it's all knowledge derived from basic concepts interrelated. Now, matters of fact are described more in synthetic fashion. That is to say, they could be false. They're not necessarily true. They're contingent truths. They could be false. And they could be false because the predicate adds something that isn't already logically tied to the subject. All bachelors are miserable. You see. It may be true, but there's no logical connection between the two. So that you've got there synthetic truths, what sometimes is called factual truth, sometimes material truths. That is to say, they've got subject matter. So you've got these two, and in the latter you would have all the sciences. Physical science, life sciences, psychological science, what then would be called mental science. You see? So all the sciences would fit there. And, of course, metaphysics, which was taken to be a science. It was Hume who told us, no, it's not. It's no science, because it doesn't yield knowledge. You see. But prior to Hume, yeah, this is the way it would have been considered. Now, you can see from this the definitions begin to appear. Analytic, yes, the predicate is logically contained in the subject, and the proposition just unpacks it. Okay, necessarily true. Do you understand that? Predicate, what's predicated of the subject, is logically part of the subject. Okay? 3 + 5 = 8. Bachelors are unmarried males, so forth. Synthetic propositions, the predicate is not contained in the subject, but adds to the subject. Okay. Now, the distinctive thing that Kant does, however, is to bring to bear on that distinction the further distinction between a priori and a posteriori. Now, the term a posteriori is the easier one to get a hold of, meaning simply dependent on experience. Dependent on experience, posterior to experience. And Kant, therefore, was quick to say that there are sure synthetic a posteriori statements, propositions. Yeah. There are things that we say that seem to be based simply on experience. Synthetic a posteriori. And likewise, he wasn't saying anything new when he said we have analytic a priori propositions. A priori means, in its simplest terms, independently of experience. And obviously, analytic relations of ideas are independently of experience. You don't have to count your fingers if you really understand the concepts of 2 and 1 to understand that 2 + 1 = 3. It's logically necessary. So in those two regards, no problem. The problem comes when he adds to that the notion of synthetic a priori, which seems to be mixing apples and pears. You see. Peaches and bananas. Synthetic a priori. You see. Now, in order to see more clearly what he's doing in this, let's get what he means by a priori a little more precisely. I guess in most of our introductory courses we content ourselves with the statement that a priori means independently of experience. But Kant wasn't content with that. Kant wants to say that a priori knowledge is going to be universal and necessary. Universal and necessary. So that a priori truths are going to be universally true. Not just relative to some particular situation. Universally true. And necessarily true. They couldn't possibly be false. Yeah. Because it's not just the analytic which is necessarily true, but the a priori is necessarily true. You see? So you've got two kinds of a priori knowledge, not just one. You've got the analytic a priori, like tautologies, and you've got the synthetic a priori, like physics, perhaps metaphysics, certainly mathematics, which he pulls down there. Yeah, because the synthetic a priori for Kant involves math, physics, natural science that is, metaphysics. Doing anything more than just talking about phenomena. Math, physics, metaphysics. Yeah. And you'll find that in the critique of pure reason, there are three major sections in which he comes at these. There is a first one which he calls the transcendental aesthetic, where he explains the basis for mathematical knowledge. Huh? Aesthetic? Well, hold the phone. But don't hold your breath. Yeah, aesthetic in German has to do with sense perception, with any kind of conscious awareness. Okay. So, transcendental aesthetic. Then that's followed by the transcendental analytic, which introduces him to knowledge of physics, principles of physics. And then the transcendental dialectic, where he takes a look at, metaphysics. And it's the transcendental dialectic that has those three parts dealing with rational or philosophical psychology, rational or philosophical cosmology, rational or philosophical theology. And you can check that out in the table of contents, which our editor gives us very helpfully on page 366. Do you notice? Take a look at that. On 366, he has first part, transcendental aesthetic, second part, transcendental logic, division 1, transcendental analytic, division 2, transcendental dialectic. Okay. Well, his point is then that we have rational knowledge, universal